Kelsey. This is my booktube channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I have my booktube hat on, and today I am finally bringing you my somewhat delayed review of Laini Taylor's Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. I read this trilogy spread out over the course of about half a year, and I finished this book, the final book, last month, and it was included in my May wrap-up. And I promised a review, and it took a while, but it's here. This series consists of the first book, Daughter of Smoke and Bone, the second book, Days of Blood and Starlight, and this is the third book, Dreams of Gods and Monsters, which I have out from the library right now. And I listened to the first book on Audiobook, and I got the second two from the library. This is the one I will be holding up because it is the only one physically in my possession at this time. Part of the reason this review is a little delayed is because I didn't want to film it until I had a chance to check out the novella that goes along with this series, which is called Night of Cake and Puppets, and I just listened to that this past week on Audiobook. So I will be talking about that as well. Now, because I read this series over a long period of time, things from the earlier books are maybe not so fresh in my memory, but I do have some major points that I want to hit in order to explain my overall feelings about this series, which I really did like. I really did like this series. I gave all three of the main books 4 stars. I thought they were very uniform in quality. I was worried a couple of times that it was going to go in a direction that I wasn't going to like, or that Laini Taylor wasn't going to be able to pull some things together in a way that satisfied me, but I think it all worked really well. And I was very satisfied. This series starts out as a kind of mysterious urban fantasy thing with the possible appearance of some angels in Prague, and it follows a blue-haired art student named Karu, whose life is a great big mystery. And I'm not really going to say much more about the plot of this series, because to say anything much about where it goes would be, I think, major spoilers for the first book, but it does evolve from that point into something that is, I think, a lot bigger in scope than just a YA urban fantasy story. I picked this series up because lots of people on BookTube rave about Laini Taylor's gorgeous writing style, and she does have this incredibly rich, luscious sense of language and of weaving plot lines that twist and turn in unexpected ways. She's capable both of some delightful humor and of going really spectacularly dark within the same book and series, and I appreciated that. This series is also pretty heavy on the romance, maybe a bit too heavy. I think that's something that a lot of people on BookTube feel, and I think that I agree with, that the main romance in this story gets a little tedious and overwrought over the course of 3 books. So I'm going to set this book down for a little bit and talk about specifically what I thought of each of the 3 books. The first book I mentioned I listened to on Audiobook, and I picked it up on Audiobook because the audiobook won the Audio Award for Fantasy the year it was released, and that's something I like to try to notice if I'm planning on reading a book and I'm wondering if I should pick up the audiobook instead of the physical copy. The audiobook is narrated by Khristine Hvam, and I thought the audiobook was really well done, but I did want to continue on with the series in physical form because some of Laini Taylor's more surprising turns of phrase, some of the ways she plays with the reader a bit made me want to be able to stop and reread sentences or like flip back a few pages and that sort of thing that you can't really do in an audiobook. And I just kind of wanted to see her words on the page. Also, because the premise of the series involves a lot of international travel and a lot of different languages that characters are meant to be speaking in different accents, both human languages and non-human languages, I feel like it's the sort of thing where I respect all of the choices for which characters get accents or dialects and which ones don't in the audiobook. I think there weren't better choices to be made, but it was something that I was going to be constantly paying attention to the whole time if I was listening to it on audiobook, when I really just wanted to be paying attention to the story. The first book starts out pretty small in scope. You're centered around Karoo and some of the people in her life and the mysterious, supernatural, fantastical things that start happening. And the main mystery of this book is sort of centered around who is she, what is she, where does she come from? And then once those questions are answered at the end of the book, it creates this setup for this story that just explodes in gigantic new directions. I was a little worried going into the second book that without that sort of central mystery going on, that it wasn't going to be as compelling. I gave all three books the same rating, but I think I probably liked the second book a little less. It introduces some new characters, and Laini Taylor does keep sort of playing with your perception as the reader of what's going on in the story, so she can play some tricks on you. The second book, Days of Blood and Starlight, is, of the three, I think, by far the darkest. It's the one with all of the dark, bloody, gory, battle-y stuff, which I mentioned in my wrap-up where I wrapped up the third book was kind of interesting and different. That the second book of this series is where all that happens, when in a lot of YA trilogies, it's the third book that gets really brutal and violent. I don't tend to love all of the brutal and violent stuff that tends to happen in a lot of YA fantasy these days. I feel like it's more brutal and more violent than any of the stuff that I was reading when I was a teenager. So the second book was a little on the depressing side, but overall I kind of marveled at how it opened the story up in a lot of really surprising directions, and then it left me wondering if the third book could pull it all together, and it did. What I liked best about the third book, I think, was the introduction of a new character named Eliza, and her story is sort of back in the zone where we were in the first book of, like, something is up with this person, but who is she, what is she, and what does it mean for the rest of the story? And seeing how Eliza's story was going to tie in to the overall plot was one of the most interesting things for me about this book. This also got into some themes about religion and faith and how it can manipulate and influence people's behavior, both for better and for worse. And I think Laini Taylor handled those themes in a really interesting way. There was a major point of view and set of characters in the second book who just, like, dropped out of the story entirely and didn't factor into this book at all. And that saddened me a bit, because I would have liked those characters to end up being part of this story in the third book, and they weren't. It didn't really matter, though. They sort of served their purpose in the second book, so that was, I guess, a really minor disappointment. Everyone, myself included, loves the secondary characters Zuzana and Mick in this trilogy. There is also, and I won't say who, a third, even more secondary, sort of tertiary couple that starts to happen in this book that I am also a big fan of those characters. I do really like Karoo, the protagonist of this story. I like that she is an artist and that her perspective on the world is that of a peaceful, artistic soul, and how even when she's drawn into a lot of more dangerous, perilous things, that essentially remains true about her. She's a protagonist whose decisions essentially make sense to me throughout the entire series. And a lot of the time I find in YA books that the decisions the protagonists make don't make sense to me. And so when when I get from both sort of an intellectual and an emotional standpoint where the character is coming from, I find that to be really refreshing. Now, if I were in charge of deciding what books got classified as YA and what books got classified as adult in the world, I'm not sure I would classify this series as YA. I get why it's YA. It follows a lot of storytelling traditions that are popular among young adult fantasy series right now. So it fits in with that sort of book. But I was thinking about it, and very few of the characters are actually truly teenagers. The protagonist, Karu, is technically a teenager, although I'm going to try to avoid spoilers here, but you can make an argument that she's not. And then Zuzana is definitely a teenager, and maybe a few of the other characters whose ages we don't really know. But I'm not sure that anyone else is. Eliza in this book is in her 20s, and she's working as a research assistant in a science lab. And I kind of liked that because I am not a teenager, and I like being able to identify with characters who are, you know, a little older than teenagers. So this is a YA series that I think I would recommend to not just teenagers, but people older than teenagers as well. I do also want to talk about the novella Night of Cake and Puppets, which I just listened to on audiobook this past week. This audiobook actually has two narrators, Khristine Hvam and Kevin T. Collins. And it has two narrators because it is told in alternating points of view in the first person by Zuzana and Mick. And Zuzana and Mick are fabulous characters, and getting a story told from their point of view is really just delightful. I want to thank the people who left me comments insisting that I either read this novella or listen to the audiobook. Thank you. I am glad I did. It is much more lighthearted than the rest of the series. The first-person narration is absolutely delightful. All three of the main books are told from the third-person point of view, so it was surprising to me to get first-person narration, and from these characters, I really loved it. I think that both of the audiobook narrators did a really great job with these characters. And I have said before that I would never give a supplementary story to a book or series a 5-star rating on the basis that a supplementary thing just would really have to be extraordinary to earn that 5-star rating. But this did, and I gave Night of Cake and Puppets a 5-star rating, which was actually higher than the rating that I gave the three main books, which I each gave a 4-star rating. I thought the imagery was beautiful, the humor was spectacular, the characters are lovable, it's incredibly mushy and romantic, so beware, but these are the best mushy romantic characters you will ever meet. So it's long enough that I was able to really get immersed in the story. It's labeled on Goodreads as reading order 2.5 in the series because that's when it was published, I think, between the second and third books. Chronologically, though, it actually takes place during some of the later events of the first book. So I think you could read it or listen to it anytime after the first book and you would be fine. There are no spoilers for the second book, I don't think. I think that is all I have to say about this series. I hope you enjoyed this review. I hope it was informative. And I will see you all later with my next video. Okay, bye for now.